So it says we're recording now.
Yes.
So, and it's great to catch up with you again. You got this whole thing that you just started, right? Like Pacificus Group?
Yes, the Pacificus Group, which is Latin for to make peace. And we're focused on helping businesses and organizations learn how to prevent, recognize, and resolve interpersonal conflict. And
well, that like I've seen some kind of stuff like that with like third-party investigators called into universities or corporations that do that. Is that kind of what you're doing now then?
Yes, we're a consulting company, and so we offer courses in coaching. We do traditional consulting where we'll go in and we'll evaluate, let's say, the overall health of a business or an organization in terms of the amount of conflict, what kinds of conflict. We'll create plans internally, working with internal HR departments to sort of figure out what works best for the organizational culture, right? Because every entity has a different way of doing things and a different language and a different culture, and we have to be sensitive to that because otherwise your solutions won't be as efficacious. And, we conduct investigations as well. And then, of course, there's the sort of mediation and arbitration services we provide. So that's
I had one workplace where the environment was so toxic that they had to call in a company and they offered the ability to talk to them if you wanted to talk, but they didn't want to force anybody to do it. But the problem was that the gossip in the company was so toxic that there was no specific complaint that lodged this thing, but they recognized that people were creating significant enough problems that work wasn't getting done properly, and it was undermining the value of the company.
That's exactly it. And that's why one of our sort of what we call our PRR methodology, the second R, is to recognize conflict, because a lot of people don't even necessarily recognize it. If a lot of people, let's say there's an in crowd that, let's say they're around the water cooler or they're at the bar after work and they're joking about their coworkers and that sort of behavior, it causes ripple effects in the company, and people can hear about these things. Then people wind up taking stress leave. People file complaints with regulatory bodies. There's huge knock-on effects. There's litigation, which is something I'm intimately familiar with because of my other work. And it costs, in Canada alone, I think it costs about $2 billion a year for organizations and businesses in total in the country. $2 billion. And of course, all the mental health problems that it causes the employees, and then that costs us as taxpayers because, of course, then we need to, deal with all the impact of that.
Right. That's funny because, like, I just found out about you and I didn't realize this before, and now I can totally hear it, that you used to be in the military.
Oh, I still am. I still am.
You still are?
I'm a serving officer in the Canadian Army Reserve. Everything I'm saying here today with you is just me personally with my personal business. It has nothing to do with the military. It's not DND or the government. I have to put that disclaimer out there. This is me talking as a civilian, but I am a serving officer in the Army Reserve. So it's part-time military service.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it's like when you were talking about it's the R in this or whatever, it's just like the way you organize what you're doing has this
like
sort of...
in the military. That's true. We really like them. And what's really awesome about this new enterprise of ours is that I've got this litigation and military background because I've been practicing law now for 10 years. And my father, Dr. Frank Sommers, is also on our management team, and he's one of the leading psychiatrists in Canada. And my other partner, Laval Martin, has been a social worker since I think about 2006 and has been practicing psychotherapy since about 2015. And he also has a master's of social work. So we really have a wonderful synergy between the legal side of things, military strategy, social work, psychotherapy. And I think that really brings a very unique value to the conflict resolution table.
If you look at law, and I'm more and more involved in working on cases every year, like more and more cases. One of the things that strikes me is that a lot of the time you think like they really needed to sit down and work out their problems and it would never have gone to criminal court. Mm-hmm. Is that something that kind of inspired you to get more into mediation?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been doing mediation and arbitration. I've been working in those fields since I started practicing law in 2011. And something that always struck me, especially growing up with a psychiatrist for a father, I like to joke that I've been in therapy my whole life.
Right.
Is the importance of communication skills and the importance of understanding the human condition and where other people come from. And I'm amazed at how many of these conflicts when you pick them apart as a lawyer for one of the parties, and you really have to get into the nitty gritty and understand the conflict in order to adequately represent your client, you can really sort of isolate those points where things really fell off the rails, where if there was maybe some intervention at point A or point B, maybe things wouldn't have gotten as bad as they are. And that's a big reason why I started this company, was that if we can do something to engender some better understanding about how to deal with conflict in society, negative conflict, I should say, because there's positive conflict as well, which, you know, causes greater productivity and creativity and what have you, but negative conflict, if we can raise that awareness in society as a whole, then we can reduce the overall level of conflict, which I think is very important, especially because these days it seems that we're so divided in the Western world, in every country, whether it's here in Canada, in the United States, in Great Britain, in France, wherever. You know, we see this deep politicization, and it's very unfortunate.
I was kind of like browsing Twitter, which is, I try to limit how much time I go on Twitter now.
Smart,
but yeah. Just thinking about Twitter, that seems to be a big problem in our society, and the direction we're going is that, like, these are industries based on raising conflict, getting people into an outrage mode. And it seems to affect, like, you know, people's attention spans, their focus on things that are negative, with very little conflict desire, not just, you know, no conflict resolution skills, but they don't even want, it seems to me, they don't even want to resolve their conflict.
Yeah, this is the worst angels of our nature, I suppose. We do, as human beings, we have the inclination to unburden ourselves in very negative ways with other people when other people give us the opportunity to. You know, someone cuts us off in traffic and we just absolutely lose it, or you know, we project. So I think what we're offering is really only part of the equation. I think that if we as a society are going to be able to evolve to a place where we don't have as much intimacy and conflict, it's going to require people to have a greater understanding of themselves fundamentally. If we understand ourselves better and understand what's happened to us in our lives and how that affects how we approach things and understand other people or don't understand them, that's going to help to reduce that. But I do agree with you that people do have that inclination, and it's a release for them. And people like to dogpile. We see this with cancel culture. These days, online, people just jump on these issues and try to cause harm to other people. And ostensibly, I think for a lot of them, they think they're doing it for good reasons. It makes them feel, you know, good about themselves. They feel that they're making the world a better place. But, you know, something I want to stress is I don't like taking public positions on many substantive issues these days, because people focus on the position. What I like to do is I like to talk about the process. And that's something that I think is lost in a lot of the discourse. And people like John Haidt, he's written a wonderful book on how to have, I think it was John Haidt, how to have difficult conversations. It may have been Peter Boghossian.
That was James Lindsay and Peter Boghossian.
It was Lindsay and Boghossian then. But,
yeah.
And you know, I've watched a lot of their work and read a lot of their work, and I respect both of them quite highly. I have also read Haidt's work as well, and I love him.
Yeah, it's so their book was focusing on people having beliefs that are counterproductive to problem resolving, and also believing that what doesn't, I think one of the things, if I have the correct book, I should actually try and Google what the name of it is, but they were saying one of the false beliefs is that whatever doesn't kill you makes you weaker.
Yes.
Right.
Which is inimical. And I know, for example, you know, Haidt et al., they've all talked about things like cognitive behavioral therapy and how do you make people more robust? But I think that there's not enough discussion of how we talk to each other. There's discussion of the symptoms, you know, like cancel culture, et cetera, and how people don't talk to each other. But I think there's more focus that needs to be brought to bear on how we talk to each other and how we teach people, how we teach a society to talk to each other. Because I mean, looking at the education system, I think one of the complaints of people on the right is that the education system tends to be filled with a lot of people who are of a left-wing persuasion. And I'm not saying anything about that either way, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. But certainly, I think we can all agree that if we feel that someone who thinks differently than us is, let's say, teaching our children something that we don't believe in, that's going to get our backs up. But if we instead teach children not what to think, but how to think, which I think was always the point of a liberal arts education in the first place, and the point of to some extent, primary and secondary education, then we can focus less on trying to inculcate a certain viewpoint and more about just raising good-hearted individuals who have the skills and ability to think critically and understand things, which is made even more difficult by social media, as you mentioned.
Well, I think critical thinking, I've been saying this to people recently, I think that critical thinking should be taught in, elementary school, like, sort of a slow progression into it. But that's always been my feeling as well, that the important thing to teach people is not just a series of facts or whatever, but how to think and how to process information and how to communicate. Because despite our access now to these, like, Twitter and all these other communication tools, people, I don't think, really properly understand how to communicate.
Oh, absolutely. And, I've learned so many wonderful things from my father. For example, that meta communication, 80% of our communication is nonverbal. So when you are just looking at text on a screen, you're getting maybe about 20% of the message that the person's trying to convey. You don't have tone, pacing, intonation, eye contact, body language, all these things which help inform the context of what we're saying and how we're saying it.
Or responsibility. Like, I think if you're saying something hurtful and you're actually in the person's presence, you can see the physical reaction and the hurt that you're causing. And so I think that has an effect on, even if you want to still make a point, you soften your language a little bit when you're dealing with them in person, because, most people don't want to literally make somebody cry. Right?
One would hope. And this is, I've found it very interesting. I've been in the military on and off since about the age of 18, because I left to go to law school and do some other things, and I came back. But I've been a student of military history and military theory, since that time. And something that's always struck me is that, what we learn in the military is the principles underpinning conflict. And those principles apply whether it's two people fighting in their kitchen after a long day of work, whether it's two children, having a fight in the sandbox, or whether it's two countries going to war with each other. These principles apply regardless of the stage of conflict, of the level of conflict. And, one of the interesting things to your point was that we have concerns about drone warfare and the fact that pilots of these drones, which are armed and which can take human life, there's always been a concern in military ethics circles. If we take the bloodletting on our side out of conflict, is that, for example, going to make us more willing to engage in conflict because we don't have to pay the horrible price of it? And I think,
or like playing a video game.
Yeah, precisely. That's the exact phrase that's been used in certain circles. And it's a similar issue with social media, that when we are divorced from seeing the impact of our posts or our tweets on the target of our writings, then we no longer have that experience of seeing that reaction. And so I think I hope that eventually we'll be able to grow enough as a society that we can start having these discussions, not just about what people are saying, what their substantive positions are, but how do we approach talking to each other and communicating through these new modalities? I mean, Twitter really rose to popularity, about 7-8 years ago, maybe even more recently, right? For good reason, right? I'm on Twitter for this reason, so I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's been a lot longer. It's like, I remember first hearing about it when Demi Moore and Ashton Kutcher were using it. And so everyone's like, oh my God, you can talk to celebrities. And so, of course, it was back when they were actually a couple.
Right.
And
people would want to talk to celebrities, but I guess it's a draw.
But I didn't understand why people wanted to communicate in these short bursts. And so I didn't really myself get on Twitter until like about 7 years ago. And at that point, it was kind of like, yeah, that's where everybody is. So I think, it's been a really big thing for a lot longer than.
Well, I think but it's really, I think, taken off. I feel like it's taken off in the last few years. I feel like I hear more. In any event, it's obviously very popular. I think it was Ernest Hemingway who once said that when he was writing a letter to someone, it was fairly lengthy, and he wrote at the end,
after drinking a bunch of grappa.
It's highly likely. I think he wrote something to the effect of, I apologize, I would have written a shorter letter, but it would have taken me more time. And the idea being that if you really want to be concise but write well, that's a lot harder. And speaking as a lawyer who frequently has to take these lengthy legal arguments and smush them down and within the page limits the judges give us. That's not an easy feat, right? It takes a lot of time. And when people are tweeting out, I don't think a lot of people are putting a tremendous amount of thought into their tweets. They're reacting more emotionally, and that gives rise to more conflict because there's less understanding, there's less thoughtfulness. So.
Yeah, well, especially when you're into the reply section, as opposed to just like crafting an original tweet. But I mean, it's interesting too, because there's some people who've, and I don't think it's a really good technique in terms of what it's designed for, who will actually have almost like an essay they want to write, and they put it into a whole string of tweets. So it'll say like part 1 or 1/ and then
4, 5, right.
Yeah, that's not really the right platform. And then of course there's ways of cheating where you can write it somewhere else and then screenshot it and then tweet something and post the whole thing.
Right, I didn't know that.
Yeah, but I don't think it's a place to go, as I've got a sort of New Year resolution of not being on Twitter. If I'm getting angry, I'll just I don't think it's a place to deal with anything emotional. And it's just hard sometimes, because it's so easy at the end of a day to get angry about something. It's hard to avoid, but I really think, parents are told limit your kids' time on playing video games or accessing the internet, and encourage them to do things that used to be old-fashioned kind of play. And I think that's actually a really important thing for adults, in terms of social media use and stuff, is to try and find that kind of balance. I mean, I'm not really one to talk about work-life balance. I just work 7 days a week, but
I know the feeling, but I think that there are less healthy avenues as well. So I think we're doing okay on the whole in comparison. And actually that brings up another point. Something that we really stress in our methodology is to help people put things in context, and that's in context in their own lives and in context in a historical context. So have you heard of Viktor Frankl?
I know the name, but I can't remember where I've come across it before.
Wrote a wonderful book called Man's Search for Meaning, which was about his experience in a concentration camp during the Holocaust. And one of the wonderful insights that he brought to bear in that book, the main thrust of it, is that fundamentally we have, at the end of the day, the power to frame our own experience and our own suffering in a particular way. So we can actually, we all have that choice, no matter how bad life gets. And I mean, for him, he obviously experienced a horrific part of human history. He was still able to psychologically establish a sense of normalcy to some extent, to continue on with his work and his research, actually, in the concentration camp by interviewing other prisoners, etc. And I think that's something that's lacking these days when you look at a lot of the issues people have with each other. You see, I mean, you hear this all the time when people say, you know what, when they have let's say a near-death experience, or maybe they lose a loved one, they take a step back and say, I realize that life is short, life is precious. I'm not going to sweat the small stuff anymore. It's very hard to maintain that. In fact, I think it's probably impossible to maintain that all the time. We probably burn ourselves out trying to maintain that degree of awareness or empathy. But I think we need to try to build more of that in mind, that when someone says something we disagree with, in, let's say, around the dinner table or at the workplace, that, historically speaking, I mean, we're living in such a privileged time as human beings. Contrary to, I think, some of the perspectives in society these days, we have some of the lowest levels of intrastate conflict, interstate conflict, life expectancy, poverty levels are at their lowest level in history. I mean, capitalism has risen so many people out of squalor, and just in the last 100 years alone. Access to education. We always need to try to do better to some extent, of course, though I'd say we need to temper our expectations. But placing ourselves in that context is one of the messages we really push, so that people can step outside of their own struggle, their own issues, and try to, cool off and look at whatever conflict may be arising in a more healthy manner. But
I mean, you're so optimistic about people, and I think I'm a bit more of a pessimist. And one of the problems that I've seen in I've had many different jobs in my life so far, but I've seen this sort of weird, and everybody talks about being oppressed, and they try to say there's only one kind of power, but in the kind of conflict that you'd be looking at, I've come across, especially with women, that they really like to get people fired.
Okay.
And so, in that one workplace that I was mentioning earlier, that was kind of the thing that they wanted to control who was working in what particular position, who was, they were conniving to try and get people fired. But then also, like you've said, that you don't like to take a position on right or left or, bigger issues like that. But I've thought before that socialism requires that you don't believe that people are good innately, because you have to legislate compassion. Mm-hmm. That you think that if you don't put all these things in place and have the government set up things to take care of people, then they won't take care of each other. Whereas free market and conservatives actually believe that people are innately good. And so if you leave them to their own devices, they'll do things like barn raising, or, they'll help their neighbors, and they'll generally find ways to take care of themselves and each other. But of course, nowadays, the left and right is all just seems to be one thing anyways. And I don't have a lot of faith in politicians. I don't think it is about left or right. I think it's all about perpetuating its own institutions, right? But again, this is where I'm saying, like, I'm a bit of a pessimist when I look at how problems arise and how you can go about fixing them. But I like that you're an optimist, because it's so hard to find now. Everybody's so damn oppressed.
Well, I practice what I preach, and I put it in context. 16 members of my family were killed by the Nazis. My father is a survivor of the Holocaust. He was a child survivor. And when I think about where my people, the Jewish people, have been over the last almost 6,000 years in various respects, and just in the last 100 years alone, and I see what life is like today, I wake up every morning and I thank God for not just my health and my friends and family, but the fact that I do live in such a wonderful society with all its bounty and all its positives. And there are negatives, but I truly believe, because again, I don't want to get into what my personal beliefs may be on a particular issue, because I don't want people to focus on what my positions are. I want them to listen to my message of how we communicate. I believe that everybody, when they espouse a position, is coming from a position of good. And I say this truly about even the most odious positions out there, that they have some degree of positive, at least about a certain demographic. Now, that doesn't mean that every position people hold is equally valid or equally good or is going to make the world a better place. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that if we take the time to try to understand what the person's position, underlying feeling is, rather than their position, then we start to see that maybe we can find some common ground, or we can at least respect or appreciate where they're coming from. So let me give you an example. Immigration is a great example for this, because less of an issue in Canada, but it's been a hot button topic in the United States. People on the left of the political spectrum, I think, tend to be very sort of pro-immigration, increase immigration. We want to help people. We want to, use the wealth and bounty of our nation to give a home to the dispossessed and people who are coming for a better life. And you often hear from people on the right that they want to, shut down borders, and we need to reduce the amount of immigrants, and we're changing the cultural and maybe even racial makeup of our nation. And again, these are generalities, right? Of course, there are people on the left and right who have very nuanced views on this. So I'm just using...
there's a range of reasons why people take those positions. So, sure. Like, as you said, some people, it's just like, I don't want to, compromise the genetic makeup of the people in my country. Whereas other people are just like simply going, this is an organization, or we've unified to share resources, and we have to be careful because we only have so many resources. So there's some practical decisions, and then there's some that are just ideological or, racist ideas where they haven't, actually thought about the bigger picture. And then there's people who are saying we should always let everybody in for compassionate reasons, but also because sometimes it's a bit of a virtue signal saying, we're a global community, and I think that you're the same as I am, and that they're not thinking through issues either. So,
and look, I'm fairly central in many of my beliefs, but let's take the extremes, right? So let's take on the, I guess we'll say the left end of the spectrum, this person who says we shouldn't have borders, we should let everyone in. You know, I disagree with that. I think that there's going to be a lot of harm that arises if we actually put that kind of idea into policy, if we enact that policy.
Well, the pandemic is one obvious issue.
Sure, absolutely. But at the same time, I can look at that and say, how wonderful is it that that person actually cares so much about other people? Like that shows a tremendous degree of empathy. I mean, they may be virtue.
If they really do, though, because
sure, they do, there may be virtue signaling. But another thing that we really push in Pacificus is giving people the benefit of the doubt. That is a huge thing that we feel is lost in society these days. No one, I shouldn't be generalizing, but I will for the sake of this discussion. No one gives others the benefit of the doubt. People, what they do instead is when they see someone take a position, that's open to interpretation, they interpret it in the worst way possible a lot of the time. Oh, you must mean X or you must be Y.
This gets into a Kathy Newman kind of thing. So what you're saying is
the Jordan Peterson interview. Yes, I'm familiar with that. And
but it's a good practice, actually. She did it wrong, but sure. I actually found it was a really good, when I finally learned, if you're having a communication problem, say, so what you're saying to me, repeat back to them what you think they said, because they get a chance to say, no, that's not what I meant, right? And then it spares you from arguing a straw man thing where you just didn't understand what they were saying. So it's a good technique, but of course she did it wrong.
Yes, it did garner a lot of interest though. But yeah, I think that, you know, when you're right that person on the left, this hypothetical person who's espousing this view, may be just virtue signaling. But at the same time, I don't think it causes us any harm, at least at the beginning, to give them the benefit of the doubt and instead look at the positive. Look at, you know, this person really cares about other people. Now, let's look at the other side of the spectrum, the person who, let's just say, is on the right end of the spectrum and wants to shut down the borders and doesn't want
to going with extreme positions, like the extreme right.
Just for the sake of
extreme left. Yeah.
Exactly, right? Of course, I acknowledge that there's a multitude of reasons and very nuanced amongst much of the population on both ends of the poles, both sides of the spectrum. This person on the right, what people will do is they'll hear him or her say, I want to shut down the borders. I don't want, you know, people who aren't from our nation, from our tribe, coming in, taking our jobs, ruining our country, bringing their crime with them. I think, you know, Donald Trump's comment about rapists and murderers. But I don't want to get into a discussion about Donald Trump.
Yeah, let's not do that.
but the point is, this hypothetical person on the right, if we look at what they're saying, and instead of jumping to the conclusion that, oh, this person is a racist and just hates people because of the color of their skin, and instead we say, you know, wow, this person really wants to keep us safe. He really wants to safeguard what we have, because the commonwealth of our nation is what is needed for us to all thrive and to be secure. And
immigration, I mean, to be clear too, I mean, it's a huge problem that has a lot of different components to it that have, you know, equal concerns. It's one of these things where you're never going to be perfect in what you're doing.
That's another thing we push in Pacificus, is that perfection is actually going to cause you more problems. There's a wonderful expression I heard the first time I went to Israel, which is that perfect is the enemy of good. And I think I would submit it's a mark of maturity to accept imperfection to some degree. We should just definitely be striving to improve things, but that striving for should be done reasonably, and our goals have to be reasonable. And we can have discussions, right, in society about what is a reasonable goal, and I think we should. You know, for example, sexual assault issues, which you and I are both very conversant with because of the legal world. When you look at the fact that, I think Statistics Canada said in 2018, the percentages in Canada, I think it was about 3% for women. I think this is for women over the age of 15. 3% of women had experienced sexual assault. And that was defined as anything from, I think, any individual touching, let's say touching a breast or a buttock without consent, all the way through to forcible rape, what most people understand as forcible rape. And obviously, no one's excusing any sort of sexual impropriety. In an ideal world, we'd have none of it whatsoever. But in a country of almost 37 million people with different perspectives on incidents as they arise, where alcohol may be involved, where there's a lack of good communication skills amongst most people. And,
to say that there's alcohol involved is actually quite common, and that also affects memory. So that's a big concern.
Absolutely. And I guess what I'm saying is that, 3%, yes, in an ideal world, it'd be 0%. No one ever wants anybody to be sexually assaulted at all. But what do we have to do in a society to get it below 3%? What do we have to do as a society to get it below 2%, below 1%? And you and I both seen that with the government's revisions to the criminal code, vis-a-vis, provisions pertaining to sexual assault cases, that they're
new rules of evidence, Bill C-51, a bunch of rules that are designed to get bigger convictions that obviously don't care so much about fair trials anymore. My perspective on those rules.
Yes. And look, as a criminal defense lawyer, I definitely share a lot of your views on this issue. And this is an exact example of the harms that arise when, look, I believe the Liberal government was trying to do good. They were trying to, of course, make things easier for victims of sexual assault, which is a laudable goal.
Well, the way I see it is this, that the legal system does require public faith in the legal system. And so the only voices from the public being heard are outraged voices and protests. And a lot of that is based on misinformation about what actually happened in court. So at the same time, that doesn't take away from the fact that there have been a bunch of protests, and most of the mainstream media is reporting that people shouldn't even bother going to police. So because they require public faith, the politicians actually do have to do something to try and restore public faith. The question is, do you then cater to the mobs who are protesting, or do you explain your system to the mobs better so that you can actually have a conversation about why these outcomes happen and what the limits of the system actually are in terms of their expectations? If you go in thinking, if I'm making a complaint of a certain type, that I should get a conviction if the system is just, then you obviously don't understand the system and why it's designed the way it is. Yeah?
Oh, I totally agree. And it saddens me that so many people in most countries don't understand how their own system of government works. We see these funny little clips, someone goes around, it's usually in the United States, and they'll say, what's the capital of this state, and who was this person in American history, and the people, they have no clue what the answer is. I would submit that you probably have a similar response rate in Great Britain or in Canada or what have you. There are Canadians, for example, who think that we elect our prime minister, which is simply not the case.
I wish we could.
There's positives and negatives to lots of approaches, but I guess the point I'm making is that, yeah, I agree with you. We do need to do a better job of educating people. And that's also something we espouse, that people need to understand the limits of their own ignorance. I think the old expression is that a wise man knows his own limitations.
Yeah. One of the problems that I've had over the last 5-6 years is when you try to do things like, say, a panel discussion so that you can get a broad range of perspectives, that we've just kind of got to a point where people won't even say, I can't even sit at the same table as so-and-so. So one of the problems is getting people to actually, come to the table and have a debate, knowing there's a moderator, everybody's going to get a chance to speak. And the fact that you might find somebody else's perspective loathsome or dangerous, the best thing is kind of like, instead of silencing people, the best thing you can do is counter speech, and to look at those as opportunities. And I don't ever think that I'm going to change somebody's mind, especially drastically change their mind where we're at very different odds on what we think is a correct solution. But you're not there to try and change that person's mind. You're there to try to explain to the public why you take your position, right?
Well, I think, have you heard of the Overton window?
You know what? I've heard that phrase, and if I ever knew what it was, I've forgotten. So please tell me what it is so I can help recall it.
It's sort of a poli-sci social science concept that relates to the sort of left and right of arc, or the boundaries of what's considered acceptable or appropriate public speech in a society on issues, right? And so what we've been seeing over the last 10, 15 years is that the Overton window has shifted leftward socially and politically. And that's why you have a lot of people who identify as being on the left or being progressive, who try to shut down speech that they feel is problematic or inappropriate. And I think what we need to do is we need to shift the Overton window, not with regard to what the positions are, but with regard to how do we talk to each other. I think that's something that as a society, we really need to focus on, to say, you know what, if you're going to shout someone down, or you're going to heckle someone, or you're going to deplatform them, that's going to cause more problems than it's going to solve. And that's not right. That's inappropriate. We're not going to applaud you doing that. And I think social pressure is, a very useful way of modifying behavior in a society. And we see negative aspects of that, of course, but there are positive ways of doing it as well. I mean, look at smoking, right? We were able to reduce the rate of smoking in society to a large extent by, having a lot of people look at it as, a less attractive thing for people to do.
Yeah, well, I think self-censorship is one of the problems too, in that if you make it so that somebody can't say what they're thinking out loud, it doesn't mean they're not thinking it anymore. So you're not actually solving a problem by just saying you're not permitted to say certain things. I think it's better that people, I'm a really open free speech advocate, because I think it's important to know who's thinking what, so that you can, if they're thinking something that you think is really misguided, you have an opportunity to first of all know that they're thinking it, and then to try and help them understand the situation better, so that they have more material in front of them in order to make decisions about whether or not they're going to change their mind or continue. You know what I mean? Like, if you just shame people, then all they're going to do is take the existing beliefs and retain them, but be a lot more quiet about it.
And then they elect Donald Trump. And, I watched, I saw a really funny scene from Brooklyn.
I thought we weren't going to talk about Trump.
Well, we're not about him, but the effect of silencing voices. I saw this a wonderful scene from this show, Brooklyn Nine-Nine. It's a police comedy. And at one point, the main character, this detective, is in court, and he's telling his partner about how he had this wonderful hookup the night before. And then all of a sudden, the woman he hooked up with walks into court, and it turns out she's the defense lawyer. And it turns out that in their night of meeting up and drinking and lovemaking, they never actually talked about what they do for a living. And he's disgusted with himself that he slept with a defense lawyer. She's disgusted with herself that she slept with a police officer. And I just remember thinking when I saw that, if only they talk to each other more. And I think this goes to your point as well. I'm on some of these online dating apps, and I see, and I have female friends who are on them as well. And we've all seen.
I got to say, just right there, Bumble has been a real boon for the defense lawyers.
Oh, yes.
It's resulted in so many accusations and cases. It's been, business is rolling. Everybody go on Bumble.
Yeah, absolutely. But you see people write on their profiles things like, if you voted for this person, swipe left, or if you believe in this, swipe left. And I remember thinking to myself, what if you put that on your profile, what's to stop someone who thinks those things from just lying to you or keeping it hidden and just manipulating you, right? Wouldn't it be better just to put it out there, and then you can ask them in the course of a discussion, hey, what do you think of this? And then hear what they have to say and then make a decision. But that these are very—
I think it's to save time. Like, there's some people would be like, I used to have a thing that's like, if you don't understand why the Holy Grail is funny, I'm sorry, there's no possibility whatsoever.
I don't know if too many men would lie to you about liking or not liking the Holy Grail, though. So I think you're probably on safe ground there. But I agree.
No, I dated a guy who I didn't even know about the movie. I played the movie for him, and he's just like, I don't even understand why we're watching this. And I actually started crying and I'm sorry, it's over.
I'm not sure why you were dating him if that's the case. So.
Yeah, well, because I tried your suggestion. Don't put those things up front.
But my suggestion is talk about it sooner. Don't just put it on the profile, though, because he could have lied about it if he knew what your position was, right?
True. So, now, what do you think about, what I've seen when people start dating? They're not lying to you, but they're trying to find out what you like because they like something about you and they want you to like them. And so you become like the best version of yourself ever. And you're not lying, like you're actually trying to be that person, and you kind of believe that you're that person. But then it takes, like I say, a good 3 months before any illusions that you're projecting or that you have for yourself, kind of, that's when you start finding out who somebody really is. Yeah.
The honeymoon period, right? It's long-standing in psychology. It's 3 to 5 months when people start noticing the annoying quirks and foibles of their partner, and to see if they can actually deal with them.
But I think that's affected by your actual desire to be the person, like you just kind of, without even realizing you're doing it. I don't think people are lying at the beginning most of the time. They actually just want to be that person. Sure, yeah. I remember actually my brother's girlfriend once eating a specific thing that I made to eat. And she went, "Oh my God, you must eat amazing. You're such a great cook." And I went, "Oh yeah." I was like, that's the only thing I knew how to make ever. Like, after about 3 months, she realized that I actually can't cook at all. That's just my brother's girlfriend, right? That wasn't like somebody I was dating.
Well, obviously we should strive to be honest with others, but something else to consider is
I didn't mean to lie to her.
No, but look, we call them little white lies for a reason. The fact of the matter is that this is social lubricant fundamentally. When someone
it was flattery. I think it was because I felt flattered that she liked something I made, and so I wanted to adopt this idea that I can make good food.
It would also be, I think, a little socially awkward for you to say, "Look, I'm going to be honest with you. I actually am a bad cook." No, I mean, if someone's complimenting you, the polite thing to do is to accept it gracefully, right? That's the polite thing to do. So deception.
Thank you for making me feel better about my deception.
I hope my check's in the mail. So no, look, deception. Look, none of us wants to be surrounded by people who are 100% honest with us 100% of the time. I mean, I think that's been in some TV shows or some comics or whatever, where you've got a scenario.
A liar, I think.
There we go, with Jim Carrey. That's a fine example of it. That, it's, again, like I said, it's social lubricant. And the issue is not, trying to be 100% honest all the time. The issue is, are we honest when we should be honest? Do we give people the benefit of the doubt? Do we put things in context? Do we try to understand things? This is a big issue that when we're talking about improving society, which I think everyone wants to do to a lesser or greater extent, we have to understand that it's not the end of the world if a certain policy is enacted. It's not the end of the world if a certain person gets elected. I mean, it could be, depending on who gets elected and what the policy is, but 99.999% of the time, it's not. I mean, our countries have gone through, in the last 121 years, we've gone through 2 world wars. We've gone through mass social upheaval. We've gone through tremendous social change. I mean, these are momentous events in human history, and we've weathered them. And despite the travails that we face today, we're on pretty solid footing. I mean, we've got clean air, we've got a wonderful environment, we've got, relatively low crime rates in most Western countries.
And yet everyone's so miserable and always talking about their oppression. So why is that?
Well, again, I think it comes from a good place, that people want the world to be better, and people have kind of shifted their perspective to sort of look at even the most minor of social or legal transgressions as being of monumental importance. Now, I will say, I think that that's psychologically unhealthy. That's not a value judgment. It's a statement of fact. I think that when you think that something that's really, objectively speaking, relatively mild, and that it doesn't actually cause much harm relative to the full scale of harm that a human being can experience, that it causes you to be more upset about it. It causes you to be more hurt. It causes you to be more anxious about it. And that doesn't do you any good. And that's not to say that you can't work to resolve problems or to lower the rate of incidence of problems, but how we look at them, how we evaluate them, again, putting it into context, that's something I keep coming back to because it's so important.
Well, one of the problems that I think is probably you're going to encounter a lot, whether you're a lawyer, whether you're a mediator, is that there is a loss of belief that there's such a thing as reality. So what do you do with that situation where some people are saying, my lived experience is the only thing that matters, and then they're saying, well, these are all of my intersectional points in terms of my position in the world. And I think it's actually called positionality. It's like, it seems like every noun is being turned into some sort of a theory or something like that. Yeah. You can't say it's not my position, it's my positionality. So when you're dealing with people that have these ideas and this, and you can hear it in their language, how do you get them to actually respect in a mediation point of view, to respect that the other person may have some validity to their perspective as well?
Well, I will say that this is a serious problem facing Western society these days, because for us as a society to be able to communicate with each other, we kind of have to be on the same planet, so to speak. And I do think that people who adhere to the beliefs that you're referring to, I think they're in a very small minority. They're a very loud minority. But I think,
except for that, this is what they're learning at university, right? So this is the concern with institutions right now, is that they're teaching people that these ideas are more valid because there's no facts, right? They're more valid than other facts.
Do you remember much of what you learned at university?
You know, to be honest, the focus of my life has been what I started hearing about 7 years ago, where people were using words in ways that didn't make sense to me. So,
look, I think that some of these ideas have been pushed in the academy for decades now, and certainly they're getting more press now. Things are getting more vocal, but postmodernism did not arise in the last 10 or 15 years.
No, it's been since the 50s or something. Yeah. I was really quite surprised.
And I think we need to be cautious, and we need to try to ensure that bad ideas, and by bad ideas I mean not substantive positions on issues, but literally how we view reality. I think those need to be gauged very carefully, and we need to, people who are concerned about this in various circles need to have moral courage and stand up and say, well, no, I disagree, and here's why. And this comes just down to more good speech. That's what it comes down to. It comes down to people like you and me, and people like James Lindsay, who's doing wonderful work, and Peter Boghossian, and other people who are talking about this issue of how we view reality and how we use language. To ensure
Douglas Murray, what I find with him is that he has this great ability to whittle down really, really big picture and find the perfect examples that are not just illuminating, but it's so funny the way he can phrase it. And so he's so accessible to people in a way that it's not academic.
Yes, he's a brilliant man.
Yeah. It's something that you can, connect to anybody can connect to in their actual real experience of life nowadays.
Mm-hmm. Well, and this is the thing, that we do have some wonderful people out there who are very publicly leading the charge on how do we look at language, how do we look at reality. And look, as a lawyer, I will say that the term my truth gets under my skin, because to me, the adversarial process in the legal system is designed to get at the objective truth, or get as close to it as possible. I would rather people say my perspective, which is totally valid, because Lord knows I see it in both my work with Pacificus and in my prior legal work, that you can have two people participating in the same event and they can have vastly different perspectives on what transpired. Now, that doesn't mean there is not an objective truth, even if you can't necessarily puzzle out what it is. It's if a tree falls in the forest, does it make a noise? Yes, it makes a noise. It's physics. But just because no one hears it. So I think that we do need to push back against, politely and with compassion, against these ideas that people are foisting. Because look, again, fundamentally, the people who are foisting these ideas on the rest of us in society, I think are coming from a very positive place. They're coming from a place of care and compassion and wanting to create a more just society and a just world. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't fight back against what we see as a bad way of looking at reality. But I do think it means we need to not sink down to a negative level of how we deal with it. And I think that some of the names we've mentioned, they're doing an admirable job of doing so in a very polite and intelligent fashion.
Yeah, well, it's going to be interesting to see where we end up going next, because of, like I mentioned earlier, the need for the public to have faith in the system, but a lack of tolerance for the fact-finding mission of the court. That, there's a dispute about whether or not there can be alternative facts other than complainant's version of events. And, so the mediation issue is really compelling to me, because, as I said, I think a number of these cases that have gone criminal, which is so devastating in terms of how long it takes to get through the system, the cost, and not just in terms of how much money goes into it, but the human cost in the number of years of their life where they can't be productive, both the complainants and the accused, when it could simply have been resolved by some sort of mediation. But then the problem has been that restorative justice used to include the idea that you would talk things out and maybe come to a point where people can apologize for if it's a misunderstanding or something. But then we were told, this is how dare you try to put a complainant in the room with their rapist or something like that, So there's a presumption of guilt. And also now, the way I'm seeing it, because there is an increased amount of talk about trying to do some sort of restorative justice option, but it's only available if an accused person will agree to say that they're guilty.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that we do need to craft a system outside of the criminal justice system to deal with sexual assault cases, because very often these cases are without witnesses other than the two parties themselves. There's usually no extrinsic evidence, and it becomes exceedingly difficult to parse the issue accurately. I have some ideas about how to structure an alternative system like that. I do think a restorative justice model is a wonderful way of doing it.
I think we're probably going to get into a whole massive thing. Did you know that in Quebec, they're actually designing sexual assault courts right now?
I actually wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, they, we'll talk more about that later. My concern right now is that idea is being discussed, but the majority of input that they're getting is only coming from sexual assault centers and people who are victim advocates. And so, they want to have specially trained judges, which should be specially trained in things like trauma-informed investigations, which is essentially start from believing. And so what that kind of justice would look like. But it has been fabulous catching up with you, because we've known each other for a number of years now, but we don't get a chance to talk that often. Yes. And I'm really stoked that you've done this thing, starting this new business, and with your history with your dad and the psychology and stuff. I'm really kind of keen to see what kind of things you accomplish.
Well, thank you. We're really excited. We already have actually interest from the UK and the United States, and I think we're hopefully going to be able to do some serious good here and improve people's lives. So
yeah, well, let's catch up again soon.
Absolutely. Great talking to you.